Well, welcome everyone. We are going to just take a moment and allow everybody to get logged in. I'm Joanne Geer. I'm the Executive Director for the Biopharma Research Council, and we are here to enjoy a presentation on adding value to the life science ecosystem. Dr. Neha Nigam won't be joining us today. I'll be taking her role. I'm just going to share a few things about our organization, but first I want to talk a bit about this series. The Biopharma Research Council is really focused on bringing researchers, engineers, and data scientists together across all the different silos of biomedical research. And a while back, our board started to press us to think more about commercialization. And so, along with Dr. Nigam, we developed this series, Startup Spin-Offs and Stories. And the first year was really focused on the academic side, and we had a number of licensing professionals talk about their work and how to get involved with them. And then this year, as you can see, we're shifting a little more to the industry side, and we have this wonderful presentation today about a really important collaboration. So our organization started in 2009. The Biopharma Research Council has a community of more than 10,000, largely U.S., largely East Coast, but also national and international, because we do a lot of virtual programs. I just love this quote. This is from Bob Boland, who is one of our great supporters. I think we all know it works to fly together as much as we can. I'm just going to share with you a little bit about getting involved with our organization. We have a really terrific scientific advisory board, but I'm also going to focus today on our young investigators group. And this is mostly PhDs, but not entirely. This is people who are in the early stages of their careers, and we're happy to include people who are in PhD programs as well as postdocs. And I was just refreshing everybody's titles here today, and all of these folks, in the several years they've been involved with us, their careers have developed in interesting ways. So if that intrigues you, we always invite you to get in touch with us. We're supported by a wide range of institutions, organizations, universities, and suppliers, and I'd just like to say thank you to them every day. And we are engaged actively in a number of partnerships. We are members of other organizations, and throughout the year we interact with them as much as we can. And I'm giving a special thanks today to Planet Connect. Planet Connect is an organization, a company that runs internal research conferences for large pharmaceutical companies, which are of course all proprietary and are not public. So they actually started the BRC in 2009 in order to have a platform for providing programming for everybody. Everyone on this list will be getting our weekly newsletter from now on, and you'll start to see the wonderful programs we have developed for the coming year. I'm going to give a brief introduction of our speakers, and then off we'll go. Dr. Heather Steinman is the Vice President for Business Development and Executive Director for Technology Transfer at the Wistar Institute. She's been there since 2014, and her team has been working to bring Wistar science and technology development through creative partnerships to turn innovative discoveries into transformative treatments. Dr. Aubrey Watkins is the Director for Business Development and Licensing Oncology Transactions at Merck. He is responsible for deal execution related to preclinical and clinical assets at Merck Sharp and Dohme in Kenilworth, New Jersey. His responsibilities include support for licensing and research collaborations with nonprofit, academic, biotech, and pharmaceutical companies that lead to the growth of Merck's oncology drug development pipeline. I will share that you are welcome to add questions into the dialog box on the right-hand side of your screen at any time. We'll hear a presentation, and then Dr. Steinman and Dr. Watkins are going to take a look at a case study and discuss it, and then we'll open up to have our Q&A. And I now am honored to hand things over to Dr. Watkins.
Thank you, Joanne.
And thanks, Joanne.
So, yep, Heather and I are here, and we just want to, first of all, thank you all for having us here amongst our peers to really have this opportunity. So we're thankful to really be able to just talk amongst one another, really about a conversation that we have together with both our colleagues and with one another. And if anything, by the end of the presentation today, the hope is that folks have a much better understanding of the framework for how we work within the pharmaceutical industry, the framework for an academic or nonprofit center, and some of the things that we wrestle with in terms of our ability to collaborate. So again, thanks for having us here. To get started, here, I just want to kind of give a rough sense of what we're going to cover. As I mentioned, we'll talk a little bit about the industry specifically, and then we'll move on and turn the slide deck over to Dr. Steinman, and Heather will talk about how they are structured and set up to be able to execute on the kinds of activities that we do in the business to enable these interactions and activities. And we'll both talk a little bit about the challenges, as Joanne mentioned. So what we'd like to be able to do is really underscore some of the things that can be sticking points that collectively as a community we can all begin to address with one another. So this is more or less the way we see it, the beginning of a conversation, one that we hope will evolve and we'll come back and talk about again in the future. And there will be time, as we mentioned, for Q&A as we talk about some of the things that we consider to be challenges that we'd like to highlight, but there may be others that folks in the audience may want to discuss as they listen to the conversation here this afternoon and this morning. So for me, my entire career has been spent within the pharmaceutical industry. A little bit about myself: I spent the first 10, 11 years or so of my career doing cancer research, working within the laboratories in an industrial setting. A bit atypical for me, I actually went about getting my doctorate while working in the industry. So a privilege, not necessarily the preferred way of doing it, but it gives me a different lens through which I view the world. And after that decade or so, I spent time getting to know the business. So I worked in a procurement organization focused on the research into the company. And with that, this slide here really, at a very high level, what it does for those who are unfamiliar with the industry, when there is a company that is committed to doing pharmaceutical research and development, these are the 4 key areas that we focus on as a business. You have what's very well known as the preclinical and the clinical, more or less referred to as R&D into the business. Manufacturing, which really focuses on drug supply. You have a commercial organization which is primarily focused on marketing, sales, marketing activities that have to do with both commercially available products and helping to bring products forward that are newly launched into the marketplace. And then corporate development. Corporate development from a business perspective, looks at things from a 50,000-foot level, really looking at the long-term health of a company. So we really want to be able to highlight to you what some of the things that the business development people speak about. So if you think about what you would look at and the kind of activities you would do from a research perspective, you typically find people in the organization that have grown up on the research side of a company, focused on things that are really related to what happens at the lab bench. One can think about that as molecular biology, or the way I like to think about things in all cases, just to simplify it, is there is DNA, there's protein, there are cells, and there are animals. And ultimately you have human beings. And everything that we're looking to do with regard to unmet medical needs and diseases is to really understand how these things work on a molecular level. So someone who has spent significant time in their own career, one, doing research or around the activities of research. So you don't necessarily have to be a scientist per se. What you do have to do is have a very good working knowledge of the kind of things that happen throughout the drug discovery process. And so you see here I have research highlighted because what we're going to talk about today, specifically when we talk about the interactions between industry and academia, are going to be those kind of things that we can improve upon, focus on as it relates to the research collaboration activities between industrial and academic partners. That said, there are folks within our business who focus on very specific things, and in the manufacturing arena The primary concern there from a business development activity perspective is how do we get things to the market? What are the constraints for the manufacturing process? And some of the things that you would think about if you were a business development person working in the manufacturing arena is, do I have an efficient process for manufacturing the products I want to get to my customers? Are there technologies that are required to be able to deliver those products to the marketplace? What are some of the logistical issues that we encounter as we think about how does one, after all those years of research and development, begin to manufacture a process? Oftentimes there are patents that exist in the marketplace that are specifically related to processes that could encumber things that you're looking to manufacture. So while you might have been the inventor of the particular product or molecule that will ultimately find its way into the pharmacies and our homes, a huge impediment to that process could be intellectual property that is owned by someone else, and worse yet, your competitor. So there are activities that a business development person with a manufacturing background would focus their time and energy on so that we can enable that part of the business. Supply chain is a very interesting one, and if you think about it, most of the pharmaceutical companies, when they really take a look at where their key partners are, where their drugs are being delivered, you find that in the developing world there are still, even in today's world, with all of the technology that we have, issues related to getting drugs to remote places in a form that they will be able to be utilized in order to do what they were intended to do. So in places in remote areas, one can think of places, various parts of Africa, various parts of the world where you might have a vaccine that is necessary, but that vaccine could very well require a certain type of storage along the way. These things are not trivial. They're actually issues that are wrestled with here and now today as we try to meet some of the very demands of the world. Folks have heard about Ebola. You've heard about the various outbreaks. Well, what people don't think about is how do those medicines find their way to various parts of the world? And behind the scenes, you will almost always have someone in the business development organization who's thinking about logistics. We don't own, typically in the industry, our own air fleets. We typically don't own our own shipping freighters. We don't own rail lines. So all these different activities, just logistically speaking, require someone working behind the scenes to enable these channels so that these products can be delivered to the intended customers. From a development perspective, we all know about clinical trials. And as we think about the kind of things that we need to do from a business development perspective in clinical trials, it's worth keeping in mind that there are a variety of activities. Companies all conduct their own clinical trials, but oftentimes in today's marketplace, particularly in the world of oncology, what you begin to see is that there are a lot more activities where companies are doing work collaboratively, doing work in a collaborative fashion. So you may have someone who is focused merely on enabling interactions between two companies, both with their own commercial interests, but doing so in such a way that it protects the interest of both companies, but in the spirit of being a good corporate citizen and trying to do what we're all trying to do, and that is develop the best drugs for patients for unmet medical needs, you have these collaborations that take place. So licensing is very well known and it's a common activity, but there are these collaborative activities that may or may not lead to inventions, but they really provide us with insight into how can we address issues when it comes to partnering with other companies or other academic institutions. Finance and sales and marketing. So we have business development activities that have folks focusing on the commercial landscape. And what you may not think about very often is how are drugs paid for, and how might that determine how one company with another company enters into a collaboration or enters into an agreement, or determine that it's even worth their time and effort to do things in a cooperative manner. The eyes and ears for these kind of activities very often come from what we understand from someone in business development working very closely with folks in a traditional sales and marketing end of the business. So there are all these different facets of business development that, simply said, are oftentimes just referred to as BD. But what we really want to do for the folks who have an interest in understanding, where do I fit in? How do I plug into this business? If you're someone who is on the outside looking in and you're an entrepreneur, or you are a scientist working in an institution beginning to think about becoming a bio-entrepreneur, the question always arises, who do I need to speak to?
Call Heather.
That is your answer, and we will certainly address that. And I think, in a lighthearted kind of way, Heather, it really speaks to a simple question: what is the GPS? What is my GPS to the decision maker? And so we're trying to provide a map, and hopefully this here provides some understanding of the layers with regards to finding your way around a rather large organization. And yes, call Heather. So as we move on, I want to underscore something that happened in the news today. The world's largest generic drug maker, Teva Pharmaceuticals CEO, stepped down. And if you read the headlines, what you will see is that one of the reasons cited for the lack of success under his tenure and for the company here and now really relates to some of the expense management, some of the synergies that folks on Wall Street expected to see from this company, given some of the strategic decisions and transactions that were made. And transactions are the hallmark of our business. It is the end result of strategic thinking. But once that transaction is realized and executed and a deal is signed, there is then the need to execute on that deal. And what many people don't necessarily think of as business development has itself couched in the operations of a business. So expense management, understanding costs within the organization. How are you going to realize synergies? What does all that really mean? And oftentimes there are duplication of activities. If two very large companies come together, there are going to be many overlapping functions. More importantly, there are going to be many overlapping suppliers to that business. And so as we think about sales and revenue also come with housekeeping expenses. On an annual basis, any one of our companies, pharmaceutical industry or any other industry, there is a whole host of suppliers that help that business go round. So one good example is, you could say, to give you a flavor, if a company is a $100 billion a year business, they probably spend about $40 billion a year on their supply base that helps that business go round. If that isn't managed in a very good way, and what I'm showing you now on the screen is a process. It's a methodical process. If you dig deep, it looks a whole lot like a Lean Six Sigma process or any other process where people in the beginning of that process try to understand, what is it that I'm buying? Do I have very good insight to how I get the most out of each and every dollar that I spend? And how successful a company is with its own expense management is oftentimes tied to how successful that company is in having available cash flow to conduct much of its business development activities. So for those of you who have an interest, who are pursuing graduate degrees, who look at business development merely as buying acquisitions or buying pipeline assets, there are all these other activities that really go into enabling a pharmaceutical company to do its business. So as we define what our issues are, as we gather information in a very systematic way, and we create strategies that have to be implemented, to get the value out of all of these deals that are signed with suppliers, it really requires value management. And so one statistic not cited here is that 70% of all deals that are signed never fully realize their full or maximum value.
So Aubrey, a quick question for you. Do you view academic research institutes as being suppliers and vendors to the overall goals
The,
of a
that, that,
pharmaceutical company? Because obviously we're very special as we're creating innovations. Just
that's a
curious.
it's a good question, and we talk about the ecosystem that we're all in here and now in terms of deriving value out of this ecosystem. And there are academic institutions that have core facilities that function and serve in ways very much like CROs or contract research organizations that really support the business within the pharmaceutical industry. But there is also that very important generation of ideas in the innovation reservoir, which is part and parcel to what happens in the pharmaceutical industry. So in short, to answer that question, absolutely. Absolutely, and thanks for asking that, Heather. Talk a little bit about some of the specific functions for a business development and licensing team. The acronym nowadays, BD&L, I think is fairly common across the industry. And if we think about some of the key players as you try to tap into the industry if you were someone looking to do a deal, the front line of all of this would be a search and evaluation person, someone typically with a PhD, very heavy scientific background, but the activities that this person does more or less has to do with understanding what's in the marketplace. So if we want to understand what's happening at the Wistar Institute or Duke University or any of the other fine institutions around the world, you really need a set of folks who are working full-time, really trying to understand what exists, but also educating at the same time. So what are our specific needs in any one particular company? And the way they understand the needs of the company is working very closely with the individuals who head up these different therapeutic areas. And so it's really kind of a liaison role. It's a job that requires you to understand the science, be able to speak the language, but also know the needs of the business. So you're talking about two very critical things. There's science on one hand, but it is a business. And so having that understanding will allow them to go out and proliferate into the world, be it interactions with small biotech companies, academic institutions, nonprofit organizations, you name it. The search and evaluation person is your first point of contact in theory, but ultimately that's the person who will usher you into the overall system. The transactions manager, and my role specifically within business development is as a transactions manager, and while I may have a PhD, it's not absolutely necessary. However, it's helpful. It's very helpful. But the role of the transaction manager is once things have progressed to a point where both parties, whether it's a company or an academic institution, decide that we want to enter into significant relations via a contract, then the transactions manager is the person who's going to lead that process. For those unfamiliar with business development, the first document that really memorializes the significance of these discussions is a term sheet. And so a term sheet will, at a very high level, describe what the significant terms and conditions are that we agree upon in theory before really entering into full-blown contract negotiations.
And I'm assuming, Aubrey, that confidentiality agreements are put in place at the search and evaluation stage. So even before transaction management steps into the queue.
And that is absolutely right. And we're in a business that is completely dependent upon protection of intellectual property. So conversations and those skilled in the art know when and when not to have a confidentiality agreement, but to be safe rather than sorry, it's always better to have a confidentiality agreement in place. So you have your lead representative and your search and evaluation person who interacts very closely with the transaction manager, who then becomes your lead, so to speak, from a business development perspective once you've kind of made it to second base. And so through all of that, there's the quarterback of the deal team, the transaction manager. You have legal, you have patent, you have manufacturing, you have various what you call within the industry financial supply chains, the same way that you would have physical supply chains for delivering your drugs. So you require tax attorneys. So believe it or not, you probably have 3 different attorneys that you're working with on any significant deal at a minimum. And then you have regulatory persons, and certainly last but not least, your clinical leads. So all of these folks are working together in concert with your transaction manager, making sure that any of the things that are considered important to a company are in an actual contract. And anything that's important for your counterparts on the other side of the table are also represented in that contract. And alliance managers, again, similar to the previous slide that I showed you in terms of value management, how do you fully realize the value from these interactions? You need someone watching over these kind of activities, if not on a daily basis, on a weekly and or monthly basis, to make sure that everyone knows what all the moving parts are at any given time and that we're actually achieving our goal. So here we'll just break down for you what a search and evaluation could look like within a pharmaceutical company. We have preclinical discovery, so the early stage assessment is in reference to search and evaluation people who focus on discovery, focus on lead identification, optimization. They focus on many of those kind of activities that are required in animals to determine the safety of a preclinical compound, and it's missing there, but phase 1 is oftentimes kind of a gray area that overlaps. So that's beginning of the handoff from early stage assessment into late stage assessment. And late stage assessment, if we think about oncology, has its roots really in phase 1, 2, again, kind of a gray area, on through phase 3 and commercialization.
And from your perspective, Aubrey, what sorts of technologies are universities producing? I would assume mostly in the early stage assessment category.
You know, it's an interesting question, and where universities are most active, Heather, because of their function, their role, and the kind of basic research that's taking place, is in the discovery space. You do see a lot of activities in the preclinical assessment, not so much safety assessment, but what you are looking at with institutions that are wrought with key opinion leaders or scientific experts in a particular field is an ability to really interact and collaborate, particularly through research collaborations or sponsored research, which I know you'll get to later in our talk. You see these kind of activities abound, and I think it's an acknowledgement. It's long since been, but even more so today, there is an acknowledgement that great science, more great science exists outside of the halls of pharmaceutical and in our halls of academic institutions. So we harness it through those kind of interactions. And so again, that feeds into and oftentimes informs what may be happening in a clinical setting. Transaction managers, as I mentioned, you are the conduit for executing on many of these activities. And so whether it's an in vitro or animal study or a biomarker related study, which we're hearing about in today's world much more often, not just because it's chic science, but because many of the requirements and the insight that we get from our drugs and how they're acting come from our understanding of biomarkers. And some of the kind of agreements that we do that are very common are evaluation agreements, the collaborations, the sponsored research through the study agreements, material transfer agreements. Oftentimes we have a difference in how we actually refer to them, but in the end, when you look at the terms and conditions, you know, we're typically speaking the same language. And last but not least, our confidentiality agreement. You have folks who, in large part, focus on clinical development activities. As a transaction manager, and depending on where you sit in an organization, you may do one or the other, or you may do both as a transaction manager. And as I mentioned previously, you don't necessarily have to be a scientist, but you really do need to understand the overall process. So with that, that sort of concludes my part of the discussion here. We want to get some insight on how things look, feel, and work from an academic perspective. So I'm going to turn the slides over to Dr. Steinman.
Oh, thanks so much, Aubrey. So you touched on so many important aspects of not only the complexities of a corporate transaction oriented vantage point coming from pharmaceutical drug development that is very different than how an academic organization views the world. So as I was briefly talking about innovations, early stage discoveries, inventions that are coming out of the labs in real time, our goal in academia, business development, technology transfer is really to be able to connect you with our researchers in a meaningful way. And part of our central role generally falls within this field known as technology transfer that's been around for 20 years. Generally speaking, organizations are structured in a different manner. Sponsored research, as you were alluding to earlier in the discovery phase of collaboration between academia and industry, oftentimes may be handled external to the technology transfer office, or it could be handled internally, as we're seeing a lot of changes in the technology transfer field where there's been reorganization. People want to be more efficient, people want to be streamlined so we can be a better partner to our industry partners. And so we're seeing technology transfer, sponsored projects, research and development sort of fall under one umbrella. And of course that interfaces with how we structure our corporate partnerships, how we view the advancement and externalization of our discoveries, albeit through new ventures, through startup creation or support, or through licensing. But I can't emphasize more that in order to make that meaningful connection occur, we need to be the best liaisons with our scientists and our future inventors, and to make them feel comfortable with the fact that they're interfacing with someone that's in your role. And you're a great guy, I may know that, but being able to communicate how the external world works out there, which is very different than the way that our academic pursuits and our freedom to publish and our ability to think freely and come up with new solutions. They're just very different worlds. So we love doing what we do. So other than doing all of the routine technology transfer type of activities which involve bringing in or sending out materials, those very important cell lines or in vitro, other in vivo model systems, we're really focused on protecting intellectual property, so it's something of value that can be licensed by our partners, albeit a startup or a pharmaceutical or biotech partner, in order to ensure that our discoveries are having an impact. So other than monitoring and making sure that all of those agreements that you touched on protect the institution's intellectual property, we're also actively looking to source in new partners to help us advance intellectual property. We're not only interested in externalizing and licensing IP and connecting our researchers with scientists at pharma, but we're also interested in being more efficient in developing more strategic thinking and more strategic alliances focused on core disease, therapeutic areas, so that we can interface in a very streamlined manner. That said, something that I did want to touch on is that despite our role in being key liaisons between the scientists and scientists within your organization, it's a little more complex than that. So I did say that technology transfer offices, are at the center of not only protecting and also licensing and monetizing intellectual property in order to move our inventions out to the marketplace, but we can't do it alone.
So Heather, let me just briefly here. So from the looks of it, though, and from everything you just described, it sounds like you are very much like the quarterback, maybe the Tom Brady, if you will, of the entire operation for these complicated activities in the nonprofit world.
We are. However, we can't do it in a vacuum. So similar to your transaction managers that have to interface with legal, we also have to interface with our grants group to make sure that we've reported on our inventions appropriately, that we're acknowledging all the contributors that have helped support a research program. We have to ensure that we don't have any encumbrances, that we're allowed to make available a research program for further development. We have to make sure that we're abiding by all the rules, that proper consents, that human samples, if we're utilizing them in our research, are all informed. So there are so many complexities, and chances are that designated point person from the academic side of things, even though they're responsible for coordinating all of this, they may not tell the industry partners right from the very beginning that they don't have the authority to sign the transactions that they're working on. So that's where it gets more complex. But I know that we are getting a little short on time. So all I can emphasize here is that as we look at the slide, we have significant challenges from the academic side of things. You, on the other hand, from a corporate perspective, may have multiple choices and options and partners that you can go to. We, on the other hand, need to work with key partners that we trust, that we can develop meaningful relationships with, in order to shorten our timelines, because in order to move our discoveries all the way out to the market, you're looking at 10 to 15 years, millions of dollars, and the academic partners aren't going to be doing that themselves. We need partnerships with you. It's also very challenging in the sense that, that intellectual property that comes out of academic institutions, very little of it ever gets monetized. So we need to get better, and in order to do that, we need to be working with you very early in the process, as opposed to that other slide that I just showed where pharma normally step in to license IP that's either already issued that will protect a particular product, as opposed to working very early on and creating intellectual property together. So it is key that we ensure that we are working seamlessly together to break down any of those barriers. And that said, what sorts of challenges do we see? We talked about the structure, we talked about function, culture by far is the most important. And so what do you think in the list here, Aubrey, as to what's the biggest problem?
Well, Heather, it's a great question, and as I think about culture, there's so much I don't know in terms of what's important from a nonprofit academic perspective. Some of the very details that you just described about the different offices are daunting enough, and I know as I've worked through agreements myself as a transactions manager, oftentimes I've had several different departments weighing in on multiple different areas of an agreement, and some of it's bewildering. Not all the departments across different institutions are named exactly the same, and the way that PIs and scientists and your stakeholders are connected to the organization, meaning the tech transfer apparatus, seems to be different at times. And so that's one component to it all. The transparency and trust I see that you have highlighted here. And I think this really speaks to that ecosystem as where we really have common interests, both personally beyond just our professional interest, is how does this ecosystem really work? How does it really generate an engine that keeps us at the forefront, that keeps the entire community, pharma, academia, moving forward and at the cutting edge, is understanding how the other works. You know and I know both that folks can grow up in one environment or another, and we can be very entrenched in our way of thinking. We can also work very differently, and I think that's probably the crux of what we really wrestle with, is how do we work? How do we get things done? And what can be done there to really make things more efficient, if not beyond dealing with some of the structural things that all of us can kind of weigh in on. So I think those are kind of things I think about in terms of a meeting per se. Is an academic meeting different than an industrial meeting? I don't know. Do we have different expectations? The process in which we innovate and how we think.
I think of the word bureaucratic. From your perspective, do you put academic institutions into that category? Bureaucratic. Oh no, who am I working with?
I think there are, admittedly, what we would say from an industry perspective is Don't expect all of our decisions to happen very quickly. To take a simple example, multiple people tend to have to weigh in. Different levels of approval are required for things I've heard from my academic counterparts or actually seen when it just comes to signing a deal or a contract that happened much faster. So these are some of the easy ones to identify in terms of bureaucracy. So if I think of bureaucracy that way, I would say more complicated on the industrial side, less complicated on the academic side.
That's amazing, and I have the opposite view.
So I think this provides, and maybe we'll hear from the audience as we talk about this, some fodder for things to kind of ponder as we think about how do we make this better. I don't expect us to tackle that in this call. In the future, hopefully we've laid the groundwork for things that we think about, and that our counterparts on the line today also probably have some thoughts and ideas about that. So as we kind of move along here, we talked a little bit about case studies, and so Heather and I actually just thought about some of the things that were, came to mind very easily for us, and we thought we'd list them here, maybe talk about one or two in depth. But why don't we go to what we think, if we think about cases or scenarios that really impact what we all do from an efficiency perspective. It's a necessary part of it. It's an essential aspect. Sort of the legal considerations around the work we do. So we talked all about transactions and tech transfer and these other lofty words, but nothing we do happens without involvement with our legal counterparts. And so these considerations are pretty significant. They can impact deal time, how fast things happen in a real time, so to speak, are very much impacted by the availability of legal support, the types of legal support, and the types of issues we encounter along the way. So it's not a cookie-cutter business, so to speak, is what we're really saying. So if we talk about sponsored research. So this was all about, we talked about research collaboration in the PIs. And one of the things that we find, and I find, I'll speak from my perspective, is understanding, and I have pretty good alignment with the stakeholders that I work with, but understanding the other side of the fence for me is something I'd like to understand better in terms of the tech transfer office, connectivity to the PIs in the institution, and that four-way communication between the contracts people, so to speak, tech transfer, transactions manager, BD person, and the actual scientists who were trying to do all of these terms and agreement laden deals for, and how that impacts the process.
Yeah, I think that's a really good example, Aubrey. What comes to mind there is that it can be so critical to get a collaboration agreement taken care of, and both parties on both sides of the equation are trying to finalize a contract going through the routine terms and conditions that you just referenced. But the most contentious points relate to publication rights and abilities, delays in being able to submit potential inventions and data and results before public disclosure deadlines, the ability to use data, the ability to grant certain rights to future inventions, the ability to grant rights to underlying existing background intellectual property. So there's a whole slew of things that you and I both work through as we're trying to finalize an arrangement, and oftentimes what I've witnessed before is that people forget about the actual investigator that is trying to do the collaboration. And so two institutions, or the institution of the company, may feel very comfortable with the terms and conditions, but it may not be a good thing for the investigator, and the investigator may in fact want less time to have their pre-manuscripts, etc., reviewed. It may interfere with their conduct. It may interfere with other things that they would like to be spending their time with. And I think that if you continue down this pipeline of being more regimented, more bureaucratic, focused on just a piece of paperwork as opposed to thinking about your key stakeholders, you should only be focused on the interests of the investigator and your partner, and then ensure that your own personal research institute's interests are being protected. So I think we can't lose sight of the importance of the collaboration to begin with, because we're working together to align our common goals without changing who we are. In fact, the whole point of research collaborations is ensuring that science progresses, the discovery and research that academic organizations are wonderful at doing gets supplemented and complemented by the skills and expertise coming from partners such as you. And it's absolutely critical that we align interests in a very flexible but efficient manner.
So if I summarize some of the key things you mentioned here that are critical to all of these interactions is how we use information that gets generated in these partnerships. Inventions may arise in these partnerships. We'd like for them to, in many cases, to arise, but how you deal with them, a lot of that stems back to, and publication, last but not least, with regard to the mission of our academic institutions, is to really get the information out there, which is how we all end up knowing about it in the first place. So that's all further complicated by, and we'll bring this to a close, and maybe it's a conversation for our next topic when we talk about this ecosystem of companies that are being spun off from academic institutions. So I think this is a good place to stop, and we'll let the moderators here take any questions from the audience for any Q&A, and we'll try our best to address them.
Well, hello, this is Joanne again. Thank you very much. That was a terrific presentation, and I really like you're mentioning that we will reconvene in the future to talk more. Let's see, we have a couple of questions, and I'll bring these in from the audience. Have academic institutions considered pooling and packaging their respective IP that might create higher value offerings? I expect the licensing-royalty sharing agreement could be worked out.
Yes, in fact, a lot of academic organizations have discussed it. I'm not too clear on very successful models of that occurring, and here's the reason why. You can have a bundle of intellectual property, but the question is, what is that intellectual property and how does it advance the ultimate product? So if you're pooling IP that may be in various stages from patent pending to issued patent claims, and none of it ties back to an individual product, how are you going to ensure that the partner that's licensing your intellectual property is truly going to be developing a product that falls within all of the various pieces of IP in order to generate value? I do think it's a very smart and useful discussion as it relates to developing IP portfolios for startup companies, because I think from that perspective it can help guide an investor strategy, business model that may ultimately lead to multiple companies that could be pulled into a startup. So I wouldn't discount it from that perspective, but I would certainly discount it from the perspective of a pharmaceutical partner that's willing to step in to take a license, because in my opinion, the best approach is to be working side by side with your partner, to have a sponsored research agreement in place, perhaps an option or a license to the university's background intellectual property simultaneous with that execution of the sponsored research agreement, and then both the academic partner and the pharmaceutical partner work together, even if it's joint intellectual property that results from that relationship, which is what the parties would hope. It doesn't matter, because the pharmaceutical partner ultimately has to come back to secure an exclusive right to the future IP in order to develop the ultimate product and to distribute it, as Aubrey had discussed about the supply manufacturing chain. So I think that that is a very fruitful model that works, that aligns interests. I do think that the IP bundling could be good for startups, but as it relates to licensing discrete assets that our pharma partner would be interested in developing, I would feel in the life sciences space that that model may not be as fruitful.
Excuse me. Great. Thank you. We have another good question. So big and mid-sized pharma and biotech companies provide the only exit for small startup technology companies. The big companies are the only ones that can afford the exorbitant cost of development. So Aubrey, at a company like Merck, has to shift through thousands of business development requests. He's feeling for you. There are only 100 or so big companies for all these technologies from academia and startup companies. How can we break up this bottleneck? Thanks, my friend. I know who this is.
You know, I think the last part I don't quite understand, but I'll try to address that. Meaning there's about 100 companies that are able to really capitalize on accessing technology in other companies for licensing opportunities. Is that more or less sum up what I just heard?
Yeah, basically the tightness of the market, if you
Ah.
exactly.
Boy, that may be a question beyond the scope of just big pharma in terms of, I think that talks about the entire ecosystem though, with regard to the ability to harness resources. And I think where we kind of left off here in terms of spin-off companies, it might be a question more or less for the role of what we're talking about for academic and nonprofit institutions that are in many ways looking at their PIs as potential generators of IP and then taking it a step further and supporting them in ways that have not necessarily been done so in the past. That provides an interesting sort of divide or a gap or bridge that we have to kind of focus on going forward is how do we, when we think about it from a business development perspective, really deal with what I refer to as the having your cake and eat it too scenario, where you have agreements historically that are focused on academic and industrial partners only, and that's really talking about the big institution without the focus on the PI. So to be able to create a way for the PI to go out to become an entrepreneur with a spinoff and do a deal when they really don't have the resources themselves to really work on things in their own facilities, own laboratories, etc., that would be of interest and far enough along to pharmaceutical companies that enable them to now participate in that overall process. That, I think, is a societal issue that's an industry concern, and you see different companies trying different things, trying to be creative to enable that. I think the whole notion of venture capital, different ways folks are funded, that model is changing. You see that in terms of who sits at the table and when, maybe all parties sitting at the table at the same time. Oftentimes these days are the kind of things that you can see. But I do think that is part of what you see in some of the writings in the literature and the thinking of how do we, particularly when you think about some of the conversation in the general populace these days about drug prices and our healthcare system in general, is how do we enable a more efficient system? It's not one that we're immune to, but we're not the only aspect of it.
Aubrey, I'd like to ask a follow-up question actually. Can you just talk about how you triage in your own office? You must get many, many, many more interesting requests than you can, well, than one person can manage, but how do you make choices about what you'll pursue?
And do you start with a partner that's providing the opportunities? Do you do vetting of your academic partners?
So, and I'll speak generally here.
That's a loaded answer there. Yeah.
Sure is.
I'll speak generally because I think it's applicable for all companies, large companies, let's say that top 100 that have to vet. And so there are rather well-known meetings for those who aren't in the know or in the field. There are the JP Morgan Healthcare Conferences. There are the AACR conferences. I'm speaking from an oncology perspective only because that's my background, but any meeting in any therapeutic area where you have a large group of scientists coming together or companies coming together are your hotbeds for these kind of interactions. So it's really real time. It's like any two molecules in the real world. Things have to come together for things to take place, right? So that's my scientific side of me coming out. If there's proximity and there's interaction, then there's the chance for something good to happen down the line. And it happens literally in those kind of places. And as you could imagine, folks would have to have conversation or take time out to really think about all of the different engagements that they've had, all the different interactions, and you have to think about it from a priority perspective. Most companies tend to make reference to, here are the key areas that we are focused on. Some companies in the new world, their philosophy is, if it's a good molecule, if it's an unmet medical need and it looks promising, we'll take a look at anything on a case-by-case basis, as opposed to relegate themselves to the old model. And so once you have that, you will then have the business development apparatus, which doesn't have endless resources, focus its attention on those sorts of activities, and you'll see those activities borne out up and down the pipeline. You'll see the supply chain people working on things relevant to that. You'll see your R&D people doing preclinical studies related to those priorities. You'll see your commercial team focus on understanding those aspects in the industry. The same way one would prioritize their own household or their own business is exactly what happens in a company when it comes to looking at these kind of opportunities. It's not so mystical after all, is what I'm trying to say.
And what weighting factor does the actual partner that's contributing the opportunity have in that decision-making process?
Well, one can only be hopeful and optimistic anytime they have the opportunity in that. But I think it really depends upon how well they educate the partner. You know, oftentimes the opportunities, and as you admit that not all of the best science is being done inside the halls of an industrial world, the key opinion leaders themselves have an opportunity, the leaders of these organizations, to really make it clear to people where it isn't clear to everyone that this is something you need to be looking at. It becomes part of the sort of business side of that all.
All right, we have another interesting question. So here we go. From an industry perspective, how is the academic research pipeline viewed in terms of relevance to potential future development? Do you have ideas for improving the communication back from industry to the areas of greatest need that can be pursued in academia to improve the ecosystem efficiency in general?
Yeah, it's a simple question, it's a loaded question, and probably part of it goes to the complexities that Heather and I spoke about from both sides of the fence. You know, what is that information flow? If someone has an idea and they're in an academic hall, they spent their entire career writing grants, rightfully so, focused on understanding some mechanism, but now would like to engage. Some folks are more engaged than others. Some folks have had prior experience and they're sort of repeat engagers, if you will, or repeat collaborators, to where there isn't really a mystery of that. And for them, the process is fairly efficient based on their network. You know, we're all people and we all develop networks, and you know, oftentimes that's how you get things done and get them done efficiently in many cases. I think that one has a lot to do with the overall ecosystem again, in terms of having a clear, understandable template for how industry and academia engages. And again, I think that's one for discussion as we move along, and you can envision people who do this for a living. If you're in an academic hall, you may find quite often that you'll have representatives from large companies whose sole job is to engage with key opinion leaders. They are a channel, they are a conduit for being able to get information, understand key therapeutic areas of interest, but also funnel information back into organizations. So that part is very much a part of the apparatus right now. It may just be that, you know, having a little more of an understanding there would demystify some of that.
Great. So we have one more question. I'm just going to check one more. Okay, there's a little bit more time if anybody wants to add one, but I think this may be the last one. What are the hallmarks of successful academic spin-offs? For example, technology maturity, a product prototype, management team at launch. What are the factors you look at?
That's for Heather, right?
I guess so.
Well, and I
You
would
want to
actually say
do it.
Yeah, well, I'm more than happy to speak to that, but I would also say that we were hoping that that would be a central point of our next presentation. But that said, I think there's a lot of factors that go into what makes a successful startup company that's going to be attractive to ultimately our acquisition partner, as some of the earlier questions came in. How can we ensure and how can we take responsibility from an academic perspective to help the company along? What can we do to support the company? And as Aubrey was speaking to, it's very expensive to get startup companies off the ground. It's not just about the technology, it's about the management team, it's about the participants, it's about the ecosystem, so it's a much bigger question as it relates to how do parties want to interface with the startup. So obviously you need good technology, you need the support of the inventor and the entrepreneur, you need incentives to be put in place so you're supporting these types of activities so you get full engagement across the spectrum. So you want alignment, once again, of academic institutions with the investigator/inventor and the startup company to ensure that that relationship is working seamlessly, and that the startup partner can access some of the core infrastructure and bricks and mortar research capabilities. As Aubrey had mentioned, core facilities, that's a great example. We should be supportive to our startups. So we need to create a very flexible, efficient ecosystem where it's a good thing that startups are getting created, and it's an even better thing because we can take measures to ensure from an academic perspective that the intellectual property that's going to be seeding the company is of high quality. So that's another topic I'd like to propose as a discussion point about improving the efficiencies overall to create valuable intellectual property that is not only going to be useful to startups alike to start building out their business plans, but also attractive to our pharmaceutical partners. It's another means of making those connections occur earlier in the process. So long-winded answer, I don't know if I actually answered the question spot on, but it's a topic of great interest and importance to all of us.
Well, thank you so much. And I'm actually going to ask you to take one more question. This is a good one. From the company aspect, what's the priority to choose from all the research on the table?
You know, so I think from a from a company perspective, that priority really has a lot to do with unmet medical need. I think unmet medical need is what drives it in terms of, you know, what are the kind of things that need to be addressed in the marketplace. There are certainly other factors that go into, you know, any business in terms of how resources are allocated to be able to address and put into action the ability to handle that need when you have to really implement a plan. But I think that's really the driving factor in today's world. And you know, we in the industry oftentimes get a bad rap. That, again, that's a whole other conversation. Someone who's grown up as a scientist working within the pharmaceutical industry, but having emanated from the academic halls like every last one of us has, there is that factor of, you know, keeping the patient first. And so that's the ultimate decision maker, is that does this entity, does this molecule have a high probability, if we spend time, energy, and resources on it, not merely for profits, but to really be able to develop it and get it to patients.
Well, that's beautiful. I'm going to give you each an opportunity to make any final comments you'd like to make.
Well, for me, and I'll just kind of go here and be brief, is I thank you, the BRC, for the privilege of being able to interact with the audience. Thank everyone who asked some very good questions. I think they hopefully serve as a foundation for our subsequent conversation.
And I'm sure he meant to say we thank you, because we're both so grateful for this opportunity.
Well, this has been a pleasure, and we will be letting everyone know when the next sessions are going to be offered, and we really appreciate everyone being here today, and we'd love to hear from you at any time. Thanks, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.